So I'm Dan Smith. I'm the lead minister of Momentum, and the reason I'm telling you that is because at this point, my wife was also going to say, and I'm Shannon Smith, and I'm his wife, and, we've been married for 26 years. But she's really sick today. So her sickness has deprived you of a tag team message today, which I really wanted to do. So there might be a couple times during this message where what I say seems a little bit awkward, like, it seems like it would have been better from a woman. Oh, it was intended to be, okay? But so maybe you have a little bit of grace with me. I'll try to smooth it over. You won't notice most of it. It'll be incredible. So years ago, after Shannon and I were first married, we had been married maybe 2 or 3 years, and we lived in the Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C. And one day she was walking through a mall in Northern Virginia, and while she was looking around, she had one of those moments where she accidentally caught eyes with a guy who was sitting at a restaurant in the mall. And in that particular mall, like sometimes there are windows where you could see people seated in the dining room, or it might be right in the doorway, there'd be seating. And she said it was just like, it was one of those awkward moments, like, oops, and I can't even imagine what it is like to be a woman in today's world, like walking in public and like, don't make eye contact, 17,000 creepers, and so it's like playing Minecraft all day, creepers everywhere. And so just that awkward moment, so no big deal, she just looked down and quickly went on walking. She went into a store. After a few minutes, came out of that store, and when she did, the guy got up out of his seat and just bolted, beelined right toward her, and he came up to her and he said hi, and he told her that he liked her hat. Shannon, when I first met her in college, used to wear hats all the time, like girly hats, like cool hats, sometimes a baseball cap, and so he complimented her hat, and she said, thank you, and the guy said, can I take you out? And to which Shannon said, thanks, but I'm married, and she dipped. She started walking away. And so this guy hurries and rushes and runs alongside of her, and he basically said, he said directly, he doesn't need to know. And she said, and she started laughing at his boldness. She laughed, and she said, I meant to say happily married. And so he took the hint, and he disappeared. So she got home, and she told me that story when she got home, and I was like, I'm going to grab the keys to the car. Maybe we can go eat at the mall. Maybe you could point out said bold guy in the mall, and maybe I can take him to the freaking woodshed. John Wick on this guy, okay? And so roughly around the same time, and this one I know was 1999. It is well documented. We had been married a little over 2 years, and I was an associate minister at New Life Christian Church in the Virginia suburbs of D.C. And at that time, me and a friend, Kevin Brungard, who is a 6'7" Viking of a man, he and I did our own version of the perfect cheer from Saturday Night Live, and we did it in church sometimes. Picture the dumbest thing you have ever seen. We come out in sweatpants and T-shirts. We have these rhymes for cheers that we've put together, and it might be a skit setting up the topic for our lead minister at the time, Brett, to preach. Sometimes it was to announce an event. And we'd talk about how excited we were for something like what we do here, the Back to School Fest, something like that. And we jump around on stage and we do cartwheels. It was the dumbest thing ever. Well, one Sunday morning we did that skit, and Brett was going to preach after that. And then about a week later, I received this email. Dear Dan, I'm an elementary school teacher in New York. I just recently attended service at your church with my sister and her family. As I was sitting there, I saw the greatest performance of my life. 2 young and energetic men cheered onto the floor and gave the best rendition of the perfect cheer that I had ever seen. The entire time, my eyes were fixed on your face, the expressions that crossed it, and the words which spilled from your lips. When the performance was over, I found it very difficult to get back into the service, so the devil used our cheer. I found myself uncontrollably turning around to see you. After the service was over, I walked the hallways helping my sister collect her 4 children. Out of nowhere, there you were. I automatically had a funny feeling in my stomach and a smile running from ear to ear. I was wearing a red petticoat that day with a pair of khakis and my favorite blue mini hair clips. I was sure that you noticed me looking at you. Our eyes met quite a few times before I left. The last thing I remember looking at was your smile and your warm, piercing eyes straight through me. I have been putting this letter off for a week, but the nature of this letter is to simply let you know that you have a profound effect on those around you. If you find yourself with the time, I would really like to hear from you. God bless, Amanda. Now, the funny thing is, I do remember Amanda from that morning. And the reason I remember Amanda is because I thought her sister's husband was her husband, and I thought the 4 kids were her kids, and she was breaking her neck to scope me that whole time in the lobby. And I was like, what the flip, man? Like, she is bold. Like, and so I see her like hurting children and the whole time staring at me. And I'm like, what in the world? And I remember talking to a guy, maybe Kevin, like, hey, Kevin, yeah, what's up, dude? Like, there's a girl like totally scoping me this whole time or whatever. And she's with her husband and kids. And so I definitely remember that whole thing. So no doubt when I received this email, in our little condo we were renting in D.C. at the time, I was immediately flattered by the Harlequin romance that I was reading by Petticoat Girl's email. But I hit print immediately, and I ran out of my little office in the condo, and I read it to Shannon in the entirety, and I even abbreviated some of it. And I read it to her out loud, and we dropped on the floor laughing. I mean, it's one of the times I really remember, she really remembers, of us early in our marriage laughing our butts off about something together. And that girl forever became known as Red Petticoat Girl, and with her favorite blue mini hair clips and her khakis. So hot. Those khakis. And so we talk about it, and we laugh about it. Remember the email and like all that stuff? We just start rolling about it or whatever. She talked about her little mini hair clips. And someone just told me afterward just now that a petticoat is more like a type of underwear that you wear under like a Jane Austen dress kind of thing. I didn't know that. I've always pictured a peacoat is what I pictured. So my wife has probably known this the whole time, and I've been laughing picturing her in a peacoat or something like that with mini and khakis. Pleated, I'm guessing. And so, anyways, so turn to Mark chapter 10. We're going to first mention Genesis 2, but you can go to Mark 10. You can download the Bible app for free. So in Genesis 2, which the series has been about, you see the original wedding ceremony. And it's performed by God for the first man and woman, Adam and Eve. And it's just a reminder, first of all, that marriage wasn't our idea. Marriage was ordained by God from the beginning. And so we see that, and in Genesis 2:24 it says, this is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. And the outdated English word that sometimes that was translated was he would cleave to his wife. They would be bonded permanently. It was a binding commitment, an oath, a covenant that they would make. And it meant that we would cleave to each other, the spouses would. And so the idea of Cleave-Land in this series is really that we're talking about marriage there. Like, what does it look like in Cleave-Land? What does it mean to bond permanently to someone else through promises and vows? And so, centuries later, in Mark chapter 10, some religious people are trying to stump Jesus by asking him some questions about divorce. And so this is what Jesus says, and he's largely going to quote from Genesis 2 in this. He says, at the beginning of creation, this is Jesus' quotes, but then he's quoting right here, Genesis. God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to or cleave to his wife. And the two will become one flesh. Now notice Genesis chapter 2, end quote. So Jesus is commentating after this, and it's the only place he commentates, where it's recorded that he says this. So Genesis 2 mentions they will become one, and the man will leave his father. Then Jesus quotes it in Mark chapter 10. Paul later quotes it in Ephesians chapter 5. Jesus also is quoted in one other gospel, but it's the same setting. So this is the only time we hear this written down by one of the gospel writers. He says, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. That's kind of a recap. Therefore, he adds, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Okay, that's the only time that's in there. And so, during a wedding ceremony, as we know, a groom and a bride, they promise to each other and to God that they will faithfully cleave to each other. And typically, the verbiage goes something like this: in sickness and in health, in joy and in sorrow, in prosperity and in adversity, until death do us part. And so here's the thing, is I've been thinking about this obviously this week. Anytime we make a good promise or a commitment to God or to someone else, you can just expect that Satan is going to bring a full-on assault and try to test our resolve in that promise. Okay, if you say, I promise you I'm going to do this thing for you, or God, I promise to you, God, that I'm going to be faithful to this thing until death do us part, imagine, just like the hackles on Satan's, high rising, like, oh, okay, I'm coming at this. Now, you promised to God? Okay, I'm coming at this. And so Jesus seems to imply when he says, let no one separate this union that is taking place right here. Let no one, it kind of feels like a little bit of a warning to the world. Don't touch this. Don't separate it. It feels like it's also a little bit of a warning to the couple. People are going to try to separate this. Like, there's an onslaught coming, okay? And it's going to look a lot of different ways, but there's an onslaught coming. It's coming. And so you can kind of be like, man, you can bet your lunch money that if you make a promise to God, Satan's going to come at that promise. He's going to test it in your resolve in every way that he can. And so some people and some things and issues and obstacles in life are going to try to break up that union. Here's a bunch of different translations, all of them correct. They're just different ways to translate from the English what is being said. But what God has joined together, Jesus said, let no one separate. So if Jesus tells us to guard or defend something, man, you just know Satan is going to make it his goal now to come at that promise, to come after that oath. So when he tells us to guard our marriage, it's at least partly because he knows Satan's going to target it. And so I want you to picture if you are married or if you are someone who aspires to be married, because not everyone who's single aspires to be married. But if you are married or if you want to be married, you can picture your future spouse. Just picture yourself in a bar fight together. Like you are back to back and the whole bar's coming at you because you walked into a Steelers bar, and you walked in wearing your Myles Garrett matching jerseys, which is better than wearing matching Disney sweatshirts or something like that. But you walk in wearing Myles Garrett and they're coming at you and you're taking their helmets off their head and you're hitting them with their own helmets. And so that happens when you wear that jersey. And so you're back to back, and there's this onslaught coming in, and you are back to back, but you're defending this union. You're defending this marriage. You're like, okay, let no one separate, including anything stupid we would do. Let no one separate. And so picture yourself in a metaphorical bar fight with Satan's onslaught coming at you. It might be personified versions of issues coming at you, like your past is coming at you. Your insecurity is coming at you. Your trust issues are coming at you. Your money issues, your sexual frustrations in this marriage are coming at you. Your parents, sometimes they're coming at you. Your in-laws are definitely coming at you. They're coming at you. People from your past are coming at you. Some old high school boyfriend or girlfriend that's suggested to you as a friend on Facebook, coming at you. Bold guy in the mall is coming at you. Red petticoat girl is coming at you. Even if you don't know petticoat is a type of underwear and you think it's a coat, coming at you. And so most of all, though, I can't say it enough, the personified thing coming at you in that bar fight is your own radical selfishness. My own radical selfishness. The biggest threat to that marriage union isn't always other people. It's your own selfishness and Satan using that to attack your union. And so today we're talking about faithfulness in Cleave-Land, and to be even more specific, talking kind of about affair-proofing your marriage in Cleave-Land. And I know there's no foolproof, this is the silver bullet, this is how we affair-proof our marriage, but there's definitely things you can do to be aware of. We got to guard. We have to defend. Or I'm a friend who has married friends, or I'm married and have other friends who are married. I can help them defend their marriage by some of the ways I go about doing my stuff. And so one of the ways that Satan tries to attack a marriage, it's alluded to in 1 Corinthians 7. And here, the Apostle Paul, a Christian leader in the first century, he's writing to Christians in the Greek city of Corinth, and he basically is talking to them about, in light of all the sexual immorality around them in this city, in light of that, that it's so important for a married Christian couple to have a healthy, active sex life. And so we talked about this a little bit last week, so I'm just going to make kind of a point about this and we'll move on to other stuff. But he says this, it's really interesting. He says the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. Do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. And I think that's really insightful just because, you know, I know my spouse has emotional and sexual needs and all these different things, but there's also other ways that she gives and receives and hears love, like love language kind of stuff, and all this stuff to be sensitive to. But it's like Paul's saying, okay, so a married couple might, for a short time, say, hey, you know what, let's agree upon what kind of here sounds like a sexual fasting, like the idea of like, I don't eat food, and the purpose of fasting from food is for prayer. And so in this case, it sounds like, okay, for a time, let's agree. We're not going to be intimate in that way because we want to focus on prayer about something. But it's like he's saying, but don't forget you're human. Like, don't forget this shouldn't be for long because you lack self-control. And the whole society around you is modeling immorality. And so therefore, be really careful because Satan is going to try to attack your marriage. He will attack it because of your lack of self-control. So defend that marriage by having a healthy, active sex life. There's a woman named Maureen McGrath who's a registered nurse, a sex educator. Most of her health stuff she talks about is related to sexuality and all that kind of stuff. But she hosts a live national radio program in Canada called Sunday Night Health Show. But in a TEDx talk called No Sex Marriage, McGrath said this. She said, a reported 20% of all marriages are sexless. And she said, that number's rising. And she said, the experts define a sexless marriage as having sex less than 10 times per year. So sex problems, I know, these are such deep issues. And so I totally understand that there are health problems. There are unresolved conflict issues, you know, sexual abuse in one or both past. That takes a lifetime to heal from in most cases. And so I understand all that. But McGrath is talking about other factors and in a sexless marriage. So she says this. McGrath says, we are having sex 10 years before we are married and are sexually bored by the time we are married. McGrath says, this is not without consequence. This sounds like church. But she says, for example, nowadays, most brides don't even have sex on their wedding nights. She said, wait for this, 10% of people in studies check their smartphones during sex. Oh, heck no. What? 10% of you need to be slapped, okay? But then she goes on to say that 95% check their smartphones immediately afterward. Oh, we are such a liberated society, aren't we? So McGrath says that only about 10% of married couples set the sheets ablaze, is how she puts it. So meaning they just have a healthy, active sex life. And so basically the idea is most bedrooms have become boardrooms, okay? And so, like boardroom, okay, cool. Keep moving along. So McGrath says, you know, if you're not, now picture this being something that my wife's voice would say from McGrath right now. This might be the main point. So McGrath says this, she says, quote, if you're not having sex with your husband, someone else may. Like that's what she says. Like you have to have a healthy sex life, and that can go both ways, of course. But when we learned, me and Shannon learned when we encountered Bold Mall Dude and Red Petticoat Girl, basically when we encountered, we kind of stumbled upon a fun little strategy, and that was from those kinds of situations, we eventually verbally agreed, man, wouldn't it be funny if any time that we were hit on, or anytime someone sent us, eventually when texting was a technological advance, you know, someone texted us something that we thought was kind of awkward, it had double meaning or something like that, then we'd immediately tell the other person, and we're just going to laugh our butts off about it. Like, just like be like, dude, man, when you got it, you got it. You know what I'm saying, girl? That kind of, and we just laugh about it and we'd make a joke about it, have fun. And so, I get hit on about as often as the Winter Olympics happens. And so for me, every 4 years, I'm like, I got the story. I was rolling through Dunkin's drive-thru and the girl that worked at Dunkin', or whatever, and I'd tell this story or whatever, and she would tell me anything. And we would just laugh about it, and it became this very fun, trust-building thing that we're not going to hold anything back of like someone flirted with me, and I'm going to keep that a secret, and I'm going to harbor that and let that grow in my mind, in my life, or whatever that is. And it just became this thing. One of the most popular pastors in America, Matt Chandler, is a village church in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He took a leave of absence last year from August to December, and so he's back now. But Matt, let me just preface by saying, really godly dude. I've met him before. Really godly dude, loves Jesus, and I think that's all the more why this story is helpful, is he had been DMing another woman on Instagram. And one day in his church, he went out in the lobby, and a woman from his church confronted him. I don't know that it was loudly or if it was quietly, but just said, you have been DMing my friend, who I guess maybe doesn't go to the church, like crazy. And like I know about, like you're DMing her when I'm with her and all this kind of stuff. And so he immediately, when the woman said that to him, he went to the elders, like the spiritual leaders at his church, and who are basically his boss and his accountability. He went to them, and he went to his wife also, and he gave his phone over to them and gave access to his email and all that stuff and said, I want you to look through this communication, and I want you to see everything that we've said to each other and all that. And here's what's crazy. When he announced in August to his church that he was going to take a leave of absence based on this and kind of revealed the story, he said this. He said, while the messages were not romantic or sexual in nature, underscore that, they were not romantic or sexual in nature, the frequency and familiarity of the messages crossed a line. Like, sit and think about that for a second. So the elders and Matt agreed with them, like everything. I submit to the elders on this. I think they're right that I need to step down, but they said he needed to step down for a time for discipline and development. They didn't feel like he had disqualified himself from the leadership position. But I think it's really helpful and interesting that he says it was the frequency and the familiarity of the messages that crossed the line. And so I just want you to picture like your spouse is maybe, and I don't know if this is the case with him, but I'm guessing, is maybe daily messaging another person of the opposite sex, and they're constantly sending messages back and forth, and there's nothing sexual, flirtatious, anything like that going on, but just that familiarity, like maybe they eventually know each other's schedules, what they're up to on Mondays, or that kind of thing, or, maybe they share some common interests that you don't share with your spouse, so they're able to connect with that, and that creates some strangeness and insecurity. And then beyond that, maybe they're starting to develop some inside jokes together that maybe aren't inappropriate, but they've got their own jokes now. It starts to get into some really weird territory, and you probably feel like the frequency and familiarity of those messages is crossing a line. And I just feel like, man, that was such a great example in a sense, or a cautionary tale about how we need to be guarding our marriages the most. And that's at this level, at the emotional level. To say this is, really important to guard our marriages here, because we're all susceptible to this. None of us are bulletproof to becoming emotionally connected with someone when we're in a marriage union. And we need to be defending that by saying, I have to be careful to not become emotionally connected to someone else. In an article called 12 Warning Signs That It's Emotional Infidelity and Not Just Friendship, Dr. Athena Stake describes the following cautionary signal. She says, when you start treating him or her as a confidant about intimate issues, when you start discussing negative aspects of your spouse or your marriage with this person, you're starting to kind of, talk to them about issues, or you're griping to them a little bit about habits or things that you don't like or whatever, or you're obsessively starting to daydream about this person. Maybe you're even thinking about what they might think about what you're wearing that day when you're getting dressed, or you're believing that they get you like no one else does. You're fantasizing about love or a sexual relationship with a person. You're starting to cover up your actions, keep them secret, cover your trail, or you're planning to spend time alone with them, or you're just letting it happen. Those are signs like, yeah, this has become an inappropriate emotional connection. And so there's a new term on the internet that people have been using for this called micro-cheating, which I think is really interesting because I think it's a great way to wordsmith. Hey, we'll focus on the micro part, and that makes me feel a little bit more justified about the way that I'm flirting, the way that I'm connecting, but I'm kind of forgetting, like, yeah, the main word here, the operative word here is cheating. And so, I'm flirting, I'm connecting, and so notice that what's happening the whole time in like this emotional affair, or one that's turning into an emotional infidelity, is that you're bonding with that person when you've committed to being bonded in that special way with this person. And so there's some pulling away that's happening, like in some way to feed the friendship, you're robbing the marriage. And so you're like, I'm pulling away a little bit, and I'm giving emotions, I'm giving time and all this energy to that. And so you're creating emotional intimacy, and you're betraying your spouse's trust. And so that's a major threat to your marriage, that you're starving the spouse to feed the friendship. A couple resources on faithfulness and infidelity. I often reach out to Encompass Christian Counseling, Sheila Mills, who runs that, and I've interviewed her at Momentum before. Sometimes I'll ask her for resources, and she has a therapist on her staff. She's like, oh, this person's a great resource. And so her therapist friend who works with them suggested this, a book called Not Just Friends by the late Shirley Glass. The therapist said this book has a lot of practical stuff and is good for both Christians and non-Christians. Good stuff on communicating and affair-proofing your marriage. Another one is called Intimate Deception, which is, the subtitle is Healing the Wounds of Sexual Betrayal by Dr. Sherry Keffer. So this author treats sexual betrayal as trauma and basically walks the victim through the healing process for PTSD. And so the therapist in this book, this is a very Christian book, and the author kind of tells her own story, and it's very validating for the person who has been wounded in the infidelity. And then a good resource just for marriage in general is How We Love by Milan and Kay Yurkovich. I wish my last name was Yurkovich, Dan Yurkovich. It's a cool name, up in your face. The How We Love materials, they're good for individuals or couples. And it's really to help you understand why you repeat the same patterns in relationships, and like how the past plays into the present for you specifically in your backstory. And so there's also a really good chapter on working through family of origin attachment issues or wounds. And it's all from a Christian perspective. And so back to the Matt Chandler thing, again, I can't say enough. This is a godly dude, a dude who loves Jesus, a dude who I am sure would say, I wasn't intending to have an affair, to cheat on my wife or whatever. But I think it's really interesting, just the picture of what he needed from his elders, the accountability that he needed from them. And it's not just true of a lead pastor at a church, like he's the only one who needs accountability to grow spiritually. That's true of anybody who wants to follow Jesus or follow through on commitments or whatever. And so in his announcement to the church, he told the elders, he said that the elders, they kind of called out his inability to see that relationship for what it was. And that what that did was it revealed something not right or something unhealthy inside of him. And so his stepping back was like, I need to figure out what that is. I need to step back and figure out what that was, because I did have an inability to see this. I was self-deceiving. I was just whatever it was. And so, Matt's not the only person that needs that. Man, a great thing about a church, a spiritual community, a Mo group, or a team that you serve on is to be on lookout for, here are people that I could invite into my life by invitation. And the way I always put it is, you give them a hunting license. You say, I trust you, I'm a dude, and I'm going to invite a couple dudes into my life. And I'm going to say, I give you a hunting license I will not be defensive. And if you ever see anything that you think is strange, not right, unhealthy, suspicious, if I'm married and you think I'm flirting with someone, then I want you to privately pull me aside, and I want you to tell me, that was a little awkward. That was kind of strange. Like, you have a hunting license, and if I get defensive, that's on me because I told you I wouldn't get defensive. I'm letting you speak into my life and saying, speak the truth in love, but make sure, speak the truth. Proverbs talks about wounds from a friend. The words of a friend can wound in a good way, in a sense. Like, man, that hurt, but it's from a friend, and I needed to hear that. It was truth. And so, maybe you're someone who a lot of people joke about, like, it's just me. It's the way I am. I'm a flirt. And really, it's a maturity issue. Like, the idea of, like, I then get married, and I continue to hold this personality, this idea that I'm a flirt. It's just who I am. And maybe you and your spouse even have this agreement on it. Like, she flirts, I flirt, whatever. And it would be a really powerful thing to say, I'm going to let I'm going to let them in my life, give them a hunting license, and let them kind of help me understand why this is unhealthy for guarding and defending our union, and let them speak truth, and let them privately call me out when they feel like I am being a flirt with other people. A couple positive things you can do. There's to guard your marriage. There's a pastor and counselor named Dave Carter. He authored a book called Anatomy of an Affair, how affairs, attractions, and addictions develop, and how to guard your marriage against them. And so, based on some research, he had this idea that was one proactive, practical strategy that he gives married couples. Basically, get 2 little spiral notebooks, one for you, one for your spouse, and for 30 days straight, each day, every day, when you wake up in the morning, you start thinking about something that you love about your spouse. And, even for somebody that loves each other a whole bunch, you get to day 16, and you're like, okay, I need the day to think about this. Like, what's another thing, And so you're like, okay, and you write down 2 or 3 sentences about that thing that you're thankful for in your spouse. And so basically 30 days straight. And so the thing is, the whole day you're looking for, thinking about, watching, like, daydreaming about your spouse. And like, oh yeah, here's another thing, 2 or 3 sentences. And that the whole day they're thinking about you. And they're trying to think about that, and they're, considering what's the thing for them. And so right before bed, maybe while you're laying in bed, hold hands specifically, look up to the ceiling, and you thank God out loud where they can hear you in a prayer to God, and you thank God for that quality in your spouse. And it could be something really, really simple. It could be like, dear God, thank you for my wife's beautiful smile. Like, when I see her across the room and people are with us, but she sees me across the room and she smiles at me, like, man, it just melts me, like her smile. And when we've had a fight and we're having conflict, we've argued about it, so we don't agree on something, and we get to the end of that, and eventually the clouds begin to part, and then she smiles for the first time, it just reminds me, like, hey, man, everything's going to be okay, and man, I love her smile. Thank you, God, for her smile. Think about doing that for 30 days with someone, okay? I mean, then you're always thinking about that thing that you're loving about your spouse, and if you run into Pink and she asks you, how are you doing? You're like, well, my wife, see, the thing about my wife is she's doing really well, because she likes that. So, all right, nobody cared about that joke. Okay. Cut that for 11 a.m., okay? And so on the way home, if you're on the way home and you're like, man, you tell your spouse, I want to take that 30 days of thankfulness challenge for our marriage. If your spouse tells you that, dude, you better accept it, okay? You better be like, yes, I'm in. It's going to be difficult for both of us. Like, not everybody has 30 glaring things or 31 glaring things. Should have done this in February. You get 28. But it's 30 days, no matter what month it is, okay? And so 30 days of thankfulness, and stop at Walgreens. Get 2 little notebooks on the way home. Second thing is pray for your spouse. Sounds so cliche. Sounds so trite. Sounds like what a preacher would say. Cannot tell you the power of this. Like, to pray for your marriage every day, to pray for your spouse every day, to know what your spouse's weaknesses are and what your weaknesses are, and to pray for them in temptation and in struggle, to remain pure, to remain faithful, and all that stuff, and to pray that for yourself. But pray for your spouse. It is a really humbling thing to know. My wife prays for different people on certain days of the weeks. I'm just make this up, but saying Monday, she prays for her mom. But to know that every day of the week, my wife is praying for me. And that some of that is rooted in, she's a person of prayer, she's a godly woman. Some of that's rooted in, I got addicted to pornography when I was a preteen and brought that into my marriage for a few years before I confessed it and started getting well from it and all that stuff. And so she prays for me and my temptation and purity and all that stuff. And I'm like, man, that is so powerful to know that every day my bride is praying for me. A third thing is talk about healthy boundaries for your relationship, your guidelines that you might have and might agree upon. They don't have to be the same as mine, but I'm going to share ours with you. Some stuff that we learned really early in our marriage and we implemented. We listened to some like talks from this old Jewish woman who is a relationship and sex expert. And she wasn't a Christian or anything like that, but man, she had some really wise stuff that we were like, ooh, we're stealing that. That's great stuff. And we would just take all these tips, and man, we felt like she was Yoda for us, man. And so we just stole a bunch of stuff from her. But some of the stuff that we decided for ourselves was, again, this is our stuff, is to proactively come up with guidelines for how we would deal with one-on-one situations with people of the opposite sex. And so we agreed together, like, we think it'd be really cool if we never were at home alone with someone of the opposite sex. And so when someone comes to our door, I don't know, they're coming, they're dropping by, and sometimes, I'm a pastor, so people want to talk to me about some things. I will step outside in freaking February, and maybe I can grab a jacket for you too, or whatever. I'll come out and stand on the front porch, and stand on the steps. We don't have a porch. Step on the steps, go in the front yard or whatever, and I'll talk to them outside because I've agreed. I'm not going to invite anybody of the opposite sex in my house. Sometimes Shannon will come home from work, and she will pull in to me standing on the front steps with, for example, Miss Joyce, Sally's sister. Miss Joyce will come over, and Miss Joyce knows our little guidelines and things that we do. So when Miss Joyce comes over and has something to drop off, but has something she wants to talk about, Shannon comes home, and she'll see me and Miss Joyce in the winter out in the front yard talking. Miss Joyce is 25 years my senior. She's like my church mom, okay? I love Miss Joyce, but she's not known for trying to seduce me. Not at all, not at all. But I just like, this is something we agreed upon. I'm not going to come up with little stipulations. She was only 25 years. She was only 17 years older than me. She was only 7 years older than me. And I step outside and I talk to Miss Joyce. Another one is never meeting alone with someone of the opposite sex alone for coffee or lunch. Man, this is really inconvenient. Again, I'm a pastor. Shannon is a person who a lot of people go to for advice. We have friends of the opposite sex, all that stuff. But I usually ask someone when I have a meeting, like coffee or whatever, I usually ask someone from the staff to chaperone it. And they don't even always sit with us. They just sit somewhere else in the cafe. And it's just another way for me to protect myself, another way for me to protect the person I'm with, another way for me to protect our marriage, because we're in a bar fight, just trying to protect our marriage. So many of our friends' marriages have been broken up. And you can't say it was because of a coffee they had, but I'm taking every guardrail I can and guideline I can to say, I just want to protect it. And the other one is, we never ride alone in a car with a person of the opposite sex. And so, man, that is super inconvenient. Like, I could save so much gas money carpooling at times, and sometimes there's no good reason. People have asked, hey, you want to ride together? Just leave your car here or whatever. Like, I got this really good audiobook I'm listening to. Like, I try to give the least awkward response first until they push to the limit where I'm like, see, I got this thing me and my wife do. Like, she thinks I'm really hot, and she just doesn't like me, like, riding around. She's really jealous. No, I don't say that. But I try to say, what else? I got to listen to the audiobook. I want to do this. No. And if it gets down to it, which it rarely has, no, me and my wife have agreed on these guidelines. I think it's best for me that I don't ride alone in a car with somebody else. And what that does is, I've told Shannon, and she's told me, if you ever see me in a vehicle or someone else ever mentions, oh, by the way, I saw Dan the other day riding with so-and-so or whatever, and I beeped at him or whatever, you have every right to ask me, why were you riding with her somewhere? Because I've given you that permission, and I've said I won't be defensive about it. So if I'm defensive about it, then that's on me. You have every right to ask that question. And man, I think that's really trust building. We've had people accuse us and be like, you guys don't trust each other at all. It's actually the exact opposite. Like, I came into marriage not very trusting, and I couldn't imagine trusting anyone more in my life than I trust Shannon now. And we built trust over the years and given reasons to build trust. And so Christianity is not about implementing 8,000 rules into your life. It's not like that. It's about a relationship with Jesus But it's also about being incredibly wise. It's also about knowing your weaknesses. It's also about knowing how to keep yourself out of situations that make you or anyone else vulnerable. And so sometimes people will misunderstand why we have those policies for us. But man, 26 years, it's been worth it. 2 Corinthians 2 says, there are certain actions we should take in order that Satan might not outwit us, for we are not unaware of his schemes. And I just think, when it comes to any promise that I've made, a binding promise to God, like this is who I want to be, this is what I want to do, I want to be faithful in this way, Satan's going to come at me or come at us, even with your commitment, if you follow Jesus, to say, I'm making Jesus my leader and Lord. And I'm not going to be perfect, but I trust him for grace, and I trust him that what he says is true and helpful, so I'm going to follow him and do what he says. You make that commitment to follow Jesus, Satan is going to come at you with everything he has to get you to break that promise, to break that oath, and to walk away from Jesus. There's a woman named Wendy Plump who wrote a painful article in the New York Times. It's called A Room Full of Yearning and Regret. And she talks about how her marriage disintegrated after she had an affair. And during the affair, this is what she says in the article, the great sex is a given. She says, when you have an affair, you already know you will have passionate sex. The urgency, the newness, the illicit nature of the affair practically guarantees that. But then the affair came to light, and when it did, her husband had an affair, and eventually the marriage fell apart. And later, Wendy, when she looked at her parents' relationship, she said this. She said, they have this marriage of 50 years behind them, and it is a monument to success. A few weeks or months of illicit passion could not hold a candle to it. And then finally, she asks this of the readers. If you were 75 years old, which would you rather have, years of steady, if occasionally strained devotion, or something that looks a little bit like the Iraqi city of Fallujah, just cratered with spent artillery? Meaning, relationally and emotionally and spiritually, I've just been ripped apart. Yeah, sure, their commitment and their dedication was strained at times. That's what commitment is. But look how beautiful this is. And man, I love that. She calls her parents' marriage a creation of time and will. Like, this is a monument to success. And she says her parents' marriage was indeed more interesting than her fleeting romance, no matter how passionate it was for a short time. I just want to end kind of on a note of grace to say, in any topic like this, I mean, so many people have crossed whatever line or boundary or what they wanted to be as a husband or a wife, or who they wanted to be as a girlfriend or boyfriend, or how they wanted to be faithful to God and have blown it in that way. And I just want to say, like one great example is King David, who was a man after God's own heart. His life gets a little dicey toward the end. Like, it's not like, man, he was doing great. Then there's some stories later on where you're like, golly, dude, wow, okay, you're not ending strong here. But in 2 Samuel 11, he's the king of Israel, and he uses his power to commit adultery with a married woman named Bathsheba, and she gets pregnant. And so to try to cover that up, he puts her husband Uriah on the front lines so that he will be killed, and then he takes her as his bride so that it will look like, oh, well, after they got married, then Bathsheba was, conceived and had his baby. And so eventually, though, when it looked like, man, he's pulling this all off, like he has committed adultery using his power to do it. He has killed a man, even though he wasn't the guy that pulled the trigger. He was the shot caller that did it. And so all this is going on. And then all of a sudden, a godly man confronts King David. And then King David realizes how he has sinned against God. And he's like, how was I so self-deceived? How did I not see this? I have really blown it. How can I even say I'm a man of God's own heart? And so I just want to say to you, man, God's grace is amazing. There's a song about it. You may have heard it. God's grace is amazing. And even for those who have been unfaithful to God, even for those who have been unfaithful to others, God's grace is so amazing. And God tells us today that because of what Jesus did on the cross to pay for our sins, that we can put our faith in Jesus and be baptized into Christ, and that our sins, no matter how unfaithful we've been, our sins will be washed away. David prayed a prayer in Psalm 51 after he committed adultery, and this is his prayer to God. I'll end with this from Psalm 51. Psalm 51 says, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit in me."